welcome. I'm Chris Bunton, and it's my honor to be Dean of the Bob Schieffer College of Communication. It's my special honor to welcome you today to our celebration of the 5th anniversary of the naming of our college for Bob Schieffer. So Bob, happy 5th birthday.
Thank you very much.
We wanted to take some time today and chat with you about what's been going on.
What's been happening lately?
Nothing. We are a college that likes to stay abreast of what's current and what's coming in the future. So do tell us. 2 years ago, you and I did a conversation in which you said you had seen nothing like the 2016 presidential election. Would you say you've seen a midterm election like the one we had this week?
No. You know, I'll tell you something. I said during the 2016 campaign so many times on television, I've never seen anything like this, that it became a drinking game among our younger colleagues at CBS. Every time I'd say it on television, they'd take another pop. Luckily, we had plenty of designated drivers, so there were happy endings to all of these stories. But my heavens, no, I've never seen anything. And I think this is kind of a part two of 2016. It certainly is unconventional. I thought the 2016 campaign was unlike any that we had seen in modern times in so many different ways. I mean, you know, one of my favorite parts of it was during the campaign. I remember when John Boehner called Ted Cruz Lucifer in the flesh, and a devil worshiper society put out a written press release saying, no, he's not one of us. I'm telling you, it's true. You can look it up. And to me, that was just, you know, just kind of was what that was about. It was really, really different. And I think this one, we saw much the same thing. One of the interesting things to me, and the part that maybe somebody in the audience could explain to me, this is the first campaign for anything that I can remember where the economy was really good, and the president didn't want to talk about it. He said, you know, it's not very exciting. I still don't understand that, but maybe he knew what he was doing, you know.
Don't you think he seems inclined to divide rather than to unite?
That was the interesting thing, the interesting part of his strategy. It did not appear to be to broaden his support, but to motivate his core supporters, the people that elected him president. And he seemed to believe that if he could motivate those people to get to the polls, then the Republicans would be all right. And you know, the fact was he's about half right. I mean, they kept the Senate, and they lost the House. And yeah, it was interesting. I said before the election that I had never gone into certainly a midterm election with less understanding or about what was going to happen. The conventional wisdom was that the Democrats were going to take the House and the Republicans were going to hold the Senate. Well, that happened, and then everybody was surprised. I mean, for once, it came out about like the pollsters said it was going to come out. And there were pluses and minuses for both sides. This was not, obviously, a blue wave, but it was a very good election for Democrats in the sense that what did they finally wind up taking? About 30 seats, which is about what we thought they were going to take. They're now in charge of the House, which means that a lot of the programs that the Republicans had been for, like, for example, trimming back the safety net, you know, cutting back on food stamps and things of that nature, that's not going to happen now, because, you know, they can keep that from happening. On the other side, the president concentrated on the Senate races, and he wound up picking up, I think at last count, about 3. He winds up still having, and I think probably what he considers the most important part of being able to do things, he still will have the Judiciary Committee and he will still have the power to appoint people to the Supreme Court and to other judgeships. He might have two opportunities here. He's put two conservatives on the court. He might wind up having the opportunity to put four on the court. I think that was very important, certainly to Republicans in the Senate. The other part of it is he has now fired the Attorney General, which puts him in charge of deciding whether or not to stop the investigation that's going on right now. Whether he will or not, I don't know. Mitch McConnell said yesterday that he did not believe that the president would do that. He said he has said too many times, I don't want to do that. Well, we'll wait and see what happens, but he now has the ability and the power to do that. I think he does not have some of the powers that he thinks that he has. For example, I found it very interesting the other day when he said he basically was going to repeal the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. Now that may be something that Congress or courts can do something about, but the president simply doesn't have the power to do that. I mean, if he had the power to do that, then what does he do next? Does he repeal the First Amendment? And then what happens after that when a Democrat is elected president and he decides to repeal the Second Amendment? I don't think the government was set up to operate in that way. And I heard a lot of people say, well, that's probably a good idea on that 14th Amendment, but they were not so sure it would be a good idea on the Second Amendment, which of course is about guns. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure we'll ever hear anything more about that. Although he did issue a declaration today about amnesty for people who don't come in through the authorized ports, as it were, the gates.
So you said in a number of broadcasts this week that this was actually not a referendum on President Trump, but it was a referendum on us, the electorate. Who are we?
Well, I think that's right, in a way. I mean, I think it was a referendum on how do we see our nation? What do we think it is? What do we think it ought to stand for? What do we think it ought to be? We got, during this campaign and in the 2016 campaign, two very different visions of what America is. And I think many of us are still trying to sort that out. The thing, probably the headline of this election was, we are still a very divided country. I would say the country is more divided today than at any time since 1968. And, you know, after the 1968 convention, Pat and I were both there. After that convention, the country all but came apart. I mean, it came very close. And the Democrats did not go back to Chicago for a convention until 1996. And before that convention, I went back and interviewed some of the main actors of the 1968. Walter Mondale was a young aide to Hubert Humphrey. I went back and talked to him. Tom Hayden, of course. By that time, I guess he was in the California State Assembly or something, but he was the leader of the opposition there. And they thought that the country almost came apart. That was what they thought. And Hayden made some very interesting observations about 1968. He said, up until that time, he said, my dad believed every single thing that the government said. If the government said it, he took it to be true. And said, I had arguments with him about, Dad, they're lying to us. They're lying to us about Vietnam. And regardless of who won that argument, all the things that were troubling America in those days, it started with a debate over Vietnam, but it soon became a debate over generations between the old and the young. There were gender questions, women versus men, rich versus poor. It all just kind of boiled up in that 68 convention. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that we ever really got over 1968. I think the beginning of questioning the credibility of the government, which began then, continued right on until today. And it was a pivotal time in the history of our country, and in some ways, we're a different country, I think, than we were prior to 1968. And we may be going through another period like that right now. Let me just give you, and this is something that, one of the things that really surprised me when as the election night unfolded. For the first time in 104 years, only one state house of the 50 state houses is controlled by, is under divided control. In other words, one party is control of say the Senate, and the other is in charge of the House. The only state where we now have divided government at the state house is the state of Minnesota. There are now 30 state capitals where Republicans control both the Senate and the House, and there are 18 where the Democrats control both the House and the Senate. And then Nebraska, I guess, is unicameral. They just have one legislative body. But that just tells you how set people are and how deep these divides are. If you're a Republican state, you're a Republican state all the way. If you're a Democratic state, you're a Democratic state all the way. And I think there was some, there were some blips along the way by both parties this time around. But I think that is the best example I can think of just how divided the country is at this point.
Well, and it makes you fear for the future of checks and balances, doesn't it?
Well, it just, partisanship doesn't bother me. What concerns me is what I call reflexive partisanship, where you find out somebody's a Democrat, so you don't have any time to listen to anything they have to say, and the other party thinks that when they find out you're a Republican, they don't have any interest in anything you have to say. You just start out by saying, well, they're wrong. I have a friend who's a Muslim, and I asked him, I said, tell me, they're the Sunnis, and then they're, what the other one, I can't.
Shia?
The Shia, yeah. I said, what is, he's a Sunni, and I said, so what's the difference in being a Sunni and a Shia? And he said, well, they do everything wrong. So that's all there was to it. Well, I think sometimes we kind of fallen into that ditch in this country. You're a Republican? Well, I don't have anything to agree with you about. Or you're a Democrat? Well, then I don't know what you would know that could tell me that would help me at all. And the country, we're always, democracies are about having different points of view. We're always mad at each other about one thing or another. That's what makes our government the best form of government that anybody has invented. But we've got to find some way to start talking to each other again, and to thinking about, well, maybe he has something to say that we might could get together on. And right now, I'm not sure we're at that point.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about partisanship, though, because 2 years ago, Senator Cruz and now President Trump were calling one another liars. Mm-hmm. And
worse.
Yes. And in this cycle, suddenly President Trump is in Texas treating Senator Cruz as though he's his new best friend. It seems partisanship at all costs. How do we trust anything they tell us? Well,
I'm not sure you can. That's why I think the American people don't believe anything that politicians have to say anymore. They've come to the idea that, well, they say whatever they need to say. And that would be the prime example of that. It was lying Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz's father had been part of the Kennedy assassination, and on the other side, I quite frankly thought it was the worst campaign that I've ever covered. When we get to the point that we're talking about body parts, I'm not sure that's going to help anybody very much. And this one, it was just like all the guardrails went down. The rhetoric went into bounds that we've never seen or heard or even expected before. And, you know, we're seeing now that some of what happened in that campaign, it carries over into the government of today. I mean, Washington now is, and I just say this, no matter what, and the White House may certainly disagree, it's in total chaos. I mean, you know, all down through the years, people, because I covered all the big beats in Washington, and I was there a long time, and people, one of the questions I was most often asked, people will say, what was your favorite beat? I bet it was the White House, right? Because, and I would say, well, yeah, it was a lot of fun, but I said, the thing you have to remember about the White House is they all work for the same guy. If you want to get some news, you want to go up to Capitol Hill, which was my favorite beat, because, you know, there are all these different factions up there, and they all want to tell you about their side of the story, and that's how reporters get news. Well, that statement is no longer apt, because there are as many factions inside the White House now as there are up on Capitol Hill. And some of them just hate each other. I mean, you know, well, you know, when you find that out, you go to him and say, well, what about that guy over there? I mean, that, you know, that's how reporters get news. And I just think we've got to find some way to kind of turn the volume down here. And you know, Martin Van Buren, not many people quote Martin Van Buren anymore, but I always like to. Maybe this may be one in a row. Martin Van Buren said, government should not be based on the excitement of the moment, but sound and sober second thought. And I think what's missing in our politics today is sound and sober second thought. And I think we all might just try that. And I don't mean just inside government, but outside government as well. There are some things to learn about what's happened here in recent years, and I think it's in our own best interest to try to solve those things.
So let's talk about what may be next in Congress. We elected a more diverse Congress than ever before. We'll have the first two Muslim women serving in the U.S. House. We'll have the first two Native American women serving in the U.S. House. We'll have the first two Latina women serving in the House from Texas. We'll have a woman serving in the House who's only 29.
Yeah.
So a lot of change, a more diverse
Yes.
House of Representatives, at least, and certainly out in the states, women taking governorships, and the Colorado citizens have elected their first openly gay governor, and there was a prominent trans candidate. What do you think that means for politics for the next couple of years?
I think it's going to change the face of politics, is what I think. I mean, one of the things I said before the election, I said, I'm going to wait and see what happens. I don't know how this is going to come out. I didn't go along with the conventional wisdom, but I said, the one thing I'm convinced of is that the deciding factor in this election is going to be women, and whether they turn out to vote, and how they campaign and so forth. Well, I'm telling you, it's not just that we had a record number of women as candidates. It's not that we had a record turnout of women voters. Let's look at who some of these women are. You've listed some, but there were also some fighter pilots in there. There were women with military backgrounds. There were women that had been big successes in business. I mean, this is a bunch of tough people. These are not people who are going to Congress and let somebody push them around. So I think you're going to see a totally different kind of Congress, and I think it's going to be a better Congress, quite frankly. I don't want to overstate this. It's going to be mostly gridlock now. I mean, it's been mostly gridlock, but you know, that's the thing we've got to figure out here. I mean, I noticed Trump the other day said, I'm not afraid to shut down the government if we don't get that wall built. Well, these people that want to shut down the government, I don't think we elect people to go to Washington to shut down the government. We elect people to go to Washington and keep the government running. And I don't think we need to congratulate them too much when they finally do that. You know, I mean, that's the least we should expect of them, to keep the government open. And so I hope with some of these women these fighter pilots and boxers and all of that. I don't think they're going to sit around and just let somebody push them around. I think they're going to demand some action, and I hope they do.
Do you think that they will elect Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House?
I think that's, I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. She is certainly going to be challenged. And there are a number of these new representatives that were elected who said that they did not pledge that they would vote for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker. Now, she has a lot of chits to call in. I learned yesterday that in her time as the leader of the Democrats, she has raised, and I mean this with a B, $750 million she has raised for the Democrats in the House over that period, which also reminds me of something else that we need to change in this country. We're spending too much money on these elections. I mean, you know, these elections have become, the cottage industry around our elections has become more important to the participants than the elections themselves. And you know, we're seeing these obscene amounts of money that are going into these races. I think there was one House race that went $40 million they spent on it. I mean, that just, on the face of it, you know that's not right. And we can just do better than that. And I always ask people, does anybody think that the quality of the candidates that the system is producing today is any better than the quality of the candidates when they were being picked in the smoke-filled rooms and back in the days before we started all of this kind of stuff? And I would argue that the answer to that is no. But our system has been so overwhelmed by money, just the system. I'm not talking about, you know, parties. That's become, they don't have time to do anything else. You know, when Pat and I moved to Washington, all the members of Congress, and we used to have Republicans and Democrats over, because I've always basically been a political reporter. They all knew each other. Their parents, I mean, their wives knew each other. Their kids went to school up there. Well, now nobody lives in Washington anymore. They don't know each other. I mean, literally, they don't know each other. They will run into each other when they come on the floor to vote, or if they're on a committee with somebody, they might know it. But otherwise, what used to be these discussions and debates we would have, which were debates among people who had respect for each other, they're now just conversations with strangers. And when you're arguing with somebody you don't know, it's a totally different argument than when you know the person on the other side. That doesn't mean you like everybody on the other side, but at least you know them. And now they simply don't. Here's an interesting little fact. In 1975, and this was after Watergate, 32 people went to jail, went to prison, or paid substantial fines for campaign finance law violations. Today, every single person that went to jail or paid a fine, everything that they went to jail for is now legal. We don't have basically any campaign laws at all now. It's just this free-for-all where you can do whatever you want to do. You can give as much money and nobody will ever know you gave it. It's a totally different world that we're living in, and somehow or another we've got to fix that. I mean, I've done stories about campaign finance laws, and so at one time Pat said to me, he said, "Why don't you stop that?" I said, "You've said that 100 times." And I said, well, but what I've come to understand, people do not understand the campaign finance laws and election laws affect them. They think it just affects the politicians. Well, it doesn't. It affects each and every one of us, because when they're having to get out there, as members of Congress now are expected in both parties to, every day they're in Washington, they're expected to spend 3 hours making cold calls, asking people to give them money, not for their own campaigns, but just for the parties. Well, who wants to spend their life doing that? I mean, just being a telemarketer. I mean, it would drive anybody crazy. And what's happened is we have made this whole process so onerous, so awful, that our best and brightest people simply want no part of it. I mean, I remember back when Olympia Snowe, who was one of those moderates, she was the perfect senator for the constituency she represented in Maine. When she decided not to run for re-election, and she would have been re-elected, she decided not to run because she said, my time is better spent somewhere else, doing something else, and I can accomplish more somewhere else. Think about that. The mightiest country in the history of the world, and she was a member of the Senate of that country, and she thought her time was better spent somewhere else. To me, that was the greatest indictment of what has happened to our electoral system that I could possibly imagine.
And it's not even clear that if you do raise all that money, you will win an election,
No.
as evidenced by what happened here in Texas. Beto O'Rourke
Yeah.
out-fundraised Senator Cruz. It didn't win him the election.
No, it didn't. And I thought Nick Kristof had an interesting column in the New York Times, and he was talking about that very thing, and he said, look, people are going to talk about how somebody did so much better than they should have or that were expected to do, but said it's not about somebody who did so much better. He said it's much better to win, and he said that's what's important, and he said, you know, that's what people have got to focus on, and that is to find ways to win. And you know, I think, and this happened in Texas, and we're now seeing it happen nationally. As the Republican Party moved to the right, the Democratic Party moved to the left. And so you've got the people that are making the difference on the far end of both political parties. And I mean, I grew up believing that what you always want to do is you want to put the extremists in your party over here and put yourself between them and the guys in the other party. But that's very, very difficult now. You know, when I came to Washington in 1969, well, back here in Texas, every single office in Tarrant County was held by a Democrat. That no Republican held any office, and that you know, of course, has changed now. But I still believe that most people are either slightly to the right or slightly to the left in varying degrees. And in those days, you had conservative Democrats in Washington, you had liberal Democrats, you had conservative Republicans, and you had liberal Republicans. And it was generally the liberal Republicans and the conservative Democrats that were able to make the deals and find the compromises, because they were, you know, more to the center of their parties. And this idea, if this bunch of guys is going to, you know, run off the stage on that side and these are going to do it over there, it just makes it harder and harder to find areas of compromise. We've also got to get over this idea that compromise is a dirty word. It's the grease that makes the government work. And when a legislative body loses the ability to compromise, then you're in a mess. And in many ways, that's where we are right now.
I think we're also in a mess when journalists can't report freely and fairly on the government. You saw the news conference this week where it was quite combative between President Trump and reporters, and as a result, CNN reporter Jim Acosta had his White House press credentials revoked. Are you worried about the ability of journalists to report freely and fairly today as a check on power? Yes, I am, but I'm not worried about somebody getting kicked out of the White House. You know, when people talk about how important it is, you know, to have that credential to get in the White House, I always point out that Woodward and Bernstein, during Watergate, never once set foot in the White House briefing room or in the White House. They did all their reporting from outside the gates, and I think you'd agree they came up with some pretty good stuff before it was over. That was a great movie.
Yeah, it was a great movie. But what bothers me, look, I've been called every single name you can be called. I mean, you know, I know all the words. I've been called all these things, and I don't pay any attention to that. It's just part of what we do. But when people start to question the right of reporters to ask questions. When people start to say, you know, I'm not going to answer anything but favorable questions, you're questioning the whole idea of a free press. We can't have a democracy if our citizens don't have access to accurate information gathered independently. That's the difference in a democracy and, you know, in a dictatorship, you know. We give our citizens the information that they can compare to the government's version of events. And if they decide the government's right, that's what they ought to do, you know, because sometimes the government is right. Most of the time the government is probably right, but sometimes it's wrong. And when it's wrong, it is our job to point that out. What we have to remember is we're not the opposition party, and we should never let whoever's in power put us in the position of telling people that we're the opposition party. We're not. We're reporters. We're independent reporters. We're not there to argue with the government. We're there to question the government. When Donald Trump was elected, somebody asked Martin Barron of the Washington Post, who I think is the single best editor in America today. I mean, he's built the Post into, you know, for one thing, they're now making money again, and they may be the only newspaper in America that is. But somebody said, so what do you do now? He said, we do our job. What's our job? Our job is to ask questions, and we keep asking questions until we get the truth. The politician's mission is to deliver a message. Our mission is to find out the truth, whatever it turns out to be, and then report it. And if we do that, we're doing what the founders expected of us to do. And when people say we're the enemy of the people, I think that's questioning the foundations of our government and what it's about. So I don't like that very much, and I'm not going to take that. They want to call me all these other names. I mean, I got called, well, I'm not even going to say what I got called at one point, but I told the guy that called me that, I said, hey, you know, in my neighborhood, that's what the sissies called each other. I said, you're going to have to do better than that if you want, if you want to insult me. But, you know, we have to take a certain amount of that in good humor. And, but the president, I think it would be better if the president would sometimes recognize that he's actually putting lives in danger sometimes with some of this rhetoric that we're seeing. It just doesn't need to be said. And words matter, and what the president says matters. And I wish sometimes he would kind of turn the volume down on that. But, you know, whether he does or not, whether he kicks everybody out and we have to, you know, report from Pennsylvania Avenue outside the gates, we're not going to stop reporting on what he does.
It could be argued that journalism might be more vigorous if we did kick more reporters out of the White House, because they'd have to go enterprise the story rather than wait for it to walk into the press room. Margaret Sullivan, the very smart newspaper columnist for the Washington Post, says that sometimes journalists have been too distracted by the latest tweet from the president or the latest statement from the White House press room to report on the bigger picture stories.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that our time would be better spent to send the interns or the lowest people on the ladder there to the White House press room to make sure that no news was made. When I first came to Washington, and I've told this story many times, I just love to hear it myself, so I'll tell it again. But when I first came to Washington, and people have forgotten this, but in the first Nixon administration, they actually had church services in the East Room of the White House. And I don't know why more to-do wasn't made over it. I mean, obviously this was crossing church and state and all that stuff. But what it was is they would invite some minister to come, and then people on the White House staff would invite their friends to come, and it became such a social thing that you know, people would pay back if somebody invited you to dinner. Well, you'd invite them to come to the church service at the White House, and it was really nice. And you know, they'd have a brief message, and then they'd sing a hymn or two, and then the president would shake hands with everybody. They'd have a little line. They'd get coffee and donuts and all that kind of thing. And so, being the rookie in the bureau, I always got sent to that. And if anything happened that was newsworthy, I would go back and tell Dan Rather, and he was the White House correspondent, and he'd do the story. But nothing ever happened. But anyway, one day we were there, and Helen Thomas, I know all of you remember old Helen, you know, the quintessential wire service reporter. And so Helen and I were always the only two people there. And one day she said, let's go get in line and shake hands with the president. I said, well, Helen, we're not supposed to do that. That's for the, no. She said, look, the Secret Service, they're not paying any attention at all. I said, get up there and get in that line. So I said, well, all right. So she said, well, ask him some questions. I said, I don't have any questions, Helen. She said, no, we'll think of something. So I was in front of her, so I got there and I shook hands with the president. Well, there was a story going around that they were going to bring in some new advisors to the White House, and so I couldn't think of anything else to say, and I said, Mr. President, these advisors, will these be in-house advisors? Oh, no, he said, these will be outhouse advisors. And then he said, oh, well, no, that's not what I meant. You know what? And he became so flustered that he turned around and walked off and never shook hands with anybody else. And I've been in Washington 3 weeks, and here I had run the president off. I always count that as one of I've interviewed every president since Nixon, and I always include that. I have to say it was my favorite presidential interview. But I guess the point I'm making is maybe that's how we should handle White House press conferences now. Maybe we should send the rookie in there to make sure nothing happens and not pay that much attention to them. I really believe we have to, because I think we could, because you have to ask these questions if they're legitimate questions.
I want to allow time in case any of our guests want to ask a question. We have a couple of mics down here at the aisles, and so please do come ask a question if you'd like. But while you're thinking about that, here's the easy but big question, Bob. What's next for journalism in an era where the president can tweet and go right around journalists, or post things on social media, or craft the message even more powerfully than in the past?
I'll tell you, Chris, the problem for journalism now is not the president. It's not our politics. The problem is the economics of journalism. Yeah. And we are in a period now. We've lost 120 newspapers over the last 12 years. In many parts of the country, it's not a question of biased news. It's a question of no news. And to underline this, when I wrote this book, Overload, about this last year, what I discovered, and it was the thing that surprised me the most, 1 reporter in 5 now lives in Washington, New York, or Los Angeles. That gives you an idea of how many newspapers are out there. There are many parts of the Midwest where there isn't any news, and so the result is many people are now getting their news on social media. And you know, this bulletin matter here, but social media doesn't vet its stories the way legitimate news organizations do. I mean, we don't print anything or broadcast anything unless we've checked it out and determined that we think it's true. And you know, the standards are really high on that. You know, things get on social media that you don't know where they came from. I mean, we found out last year that a lot of them were coming from Russian intelligence agents who disguised themselves as staying down here in Texas, the heart of Texas, which was urging Texans to secede from the Union. There was another one called Blacktivist, which urged black people to kill white people if there was police brutality. And there was another one that did just the opposite, urged white people to kill black people if they didn't kneel, or if they kneeled at the Star-Spangled Banner. All of these were just straight out Russian operations, and they were disguised to be American operations. We all know that it was absolutely false. So the need for accurate information is harder and harder than ever. And, you know, the fact that this recent election happened during the blooming of the internet and the age of the web, there's one thing, and I was thinking about this, we always use technology before we fully understand it. Best example of that is the machine gun. How many thousands of men died before the generals realized you don't defeat a machine gun by charging headlong against it. You go around and hit them from the side. And in many ways, I think that's what we're seeing here. I think the internet has had as profound an effect on our culture, and not just the media, and not just how we get news, as profound an effect on our culture as the invention of the printing press had on the Europe of that day. You know, Martin Luther thought that the printing press, he called it God's most perfect gift, and he thought once people could read the Bible in their own language, that it would be kind of kumbaya, everybody would understand now, and they'd all come together. Well, what happened was there were 30 years of religious wars after the printing press came out, and it took a long time for the Europe of that day. And eventually, I mean, all technology helps us in the long run, but getting to the long run, there are bumps along the way, and I think we're seeing that now. I mean, does anybody think that people at Facebook understood the internet when they started that company, or Google? Did the people at Uber understand the downside? Because these things have downsides as well as upsides, and I think that's one of the reasons that this election had the impact that it did, because we were really finding out how fast, you know, people say, is 1968 worse than 2016, 2018? I think 2018 posed the most danger because it was happening while we're in the midst of this communications revolution, and we're not quite through that yet. I mean, and it's going to get even more complicated with the coming of the bots and artificial intelligence. And,
Right.
you know, when these machines get to figure out how to reproduce themselves, we may all be goners. So we're going to keep that in mind.
Would anyone like to ask Bob a question?
I can't see out there. And I hope we'll have some students.
Hi. So
Hi.
Your hope is true. I'm a student. I'm a senior political science major here at TCU. And my question is, so in 2016, after the election, one of the biggest questions was, how did the polls get it so wrong? And you said it yourself in 2018 after this election, they got it very much right.
Yeah.
What do you think that difference can be attributed to? Do you think the media had a role in it at all?
You know, the polling now is so, technology has made polling more difficult than make it easier. It's the one industry. I mean, and here's an example. The CBS poll, news poll, used to be, you know, I'm prejudiced, I think it was great, but it was certainly as good as any other poll, and the other two networks had polls and so forth. But to give you an example of how things have changed, we used to do national polls, and when we had a sample of 1,500 people, that was considered a large sample, and down through the years, those polls were generally right. To get 1,500 people, you would generally have to call 3,000 people, you know, to get legitimate people on the phone. Today, in order to get 1,500 people, you would have to call 30,000 people, because, you know, we've now got the cell phones. People don't answer their phone. Nobody gives out. I wouldn't talk to anybody on the phone if I didn't know who they are. So it's made things very different, and so we're now, you know, experimenting with different kinds of polls. Some of them that you do on your computer. You find someone to talk to, and then you track them and you keep up with them. You go back to them and ask them questions. It's far from a perfect, it's more of an art than a science right now. But I think they were a little better. But you're right. The polls got it pretty close to right this time. you know, I mean, the fact is, we give the pollsters a hard time. They got the national poll pretty close to right. They had Hillary Clinton winning by a certain percentage of votes, which she did, but where they missed, you know, was on the electoral college states, and there are various excuses for that, but the fact is, it's just getting very, very difficult to find the people that reflect the community. And what makes it even more difficult is in the old day, when I was growing up, like when I used to work at the Star-Telegram and stuff, we knew that the people that live over in Westover Hills were primarily going to, that was a Republican district. We knew the people that lived out in Lake Como, that was a district, there was a high minority population there, and they were generally going to vote Democratic. And newspapers used to send their reporters out. You just go out and you know that you're assigned a neighborhood, and you go out and knock on doors and say, you know, what are you guys going to do and all that. Well, now, because of the failing newspapers and the number of staff, they don't have the reporters, they don't have the manpower to do that anymore. And just to give you an example of where newspapers are, and this is where the real crisis in journalism is, because newspapers are the backbone of journalism in America. And I, you know, started out working at the Star-Telegram. 10 years ago, the Star-Telegram had 400 editorial employees. Today, they have 40. And that is reflective of many newspapers around the country now. And, you know, like the Star-Telegram now, the editor, the McClatchy News Service, which owns them, they have gone to these regional editors. So sometimes the headlines are written in Kansas City rather than in Fort Worth. I mean, it's just a whole new world out there, and not better, quite frankly. But that's, in answer to your polling, that's why I think they did a little better this time.
Thank you.
Okay. Who else?
I'm in the middle of the aisle, so I can get out. Who do you think will be the Democratic nominee?
You know, that is a question that I don't think anybody knows the answer to right now. I mean, you know who all is talking about it. I would say, and this is just my opinion, clearly labeled as such, I would say right now that Joe Biden is probably the strongest candidate that the Democrats have. But, you know, Joe Biden is almost as old as me. And, you know, and let me tell you something. Being a person of my age, I know that I can't do what I used to do, you know, and I recognize that. I don't like it, but I recognize it. I'm not sure if he would be, what would he be, 78, I guess, when he would run? Trump, of course, is well past 70. But I think right now, but I don't by any measure say that I think he will be the candidate. But I tell you what I think right now. I don't think they have a candidate right now. I think we'll find out who the candidate's going to be down the line. But right now, I mean, I think it's just anybody's guess.
Lane?
Go ahead.
Hello again. So you spoke earlier about the record number of women that were elected to Congress and across the country. But regardless of the fact that there are fighter pilots and scientists and ex-boxers, what do you think the impact and value of having more women in politics will be on decisions made in the future?
Well, yeah, I think sometimes they're just smarter. You know, I hate to admit it, but I mean, you know, when I see some of our entry-level employees at CBS now, the women, I mean, they come to play. They're ready. I mean, and you know, nobody's going to get in their way. And sometimes the guys seem a little more reluctant. Now, that's not a scientific survey or anything, but I think women will bring a sensitivity at some points that maybe you don't always get from men. And I think they're willing to work with others as team members. But I just got to say, when you look at the people who got elected, I mean, these are people of substance. And just to repeat what I just said, I don't see this group of people being a group of people who are going to let people push them around. because a lot of them probably had a harder time than the men in finding their place in whatever profession they were in beforehand, and we know that's true. So they're used to having people tell them, no, you can't do this, and then showing them that they can. So, you know, I've got 2 daughters and 3 granddaughters, and so I'm really for them. I mean, if I wasn't a feminist, I wouldn't be here in that environment.
In the Schieffer College, we're for smart women, aren't we, Lane?
Yes, we are.
I want to be mindful of your time today and
Thanks,
make a couple of other comments and say that we are incredibly grateful in the Schieffer College for all of our supporters and donors, and you and Pat have been our most important supporters, and you are transforming students' lives with your support, and we thank you for that.
Can I just say something? Thank you. The other part, I mean, having my name on this school is the greatest honor that anyone could ever bestow on me, and it is just so meaningful, and I'm so appreciative, and I'm so appreciative of the support that the trustees have given to the Schieffer School, because we need well-trained journalists more now than at any time, certainly in my lifetime. And the reason the role and the job for journalism schools is changing too, because, you know, when I really learned to be a reporter was when I was working at the Star-Telegram, and I was the night police reporter, and my editor had been the night police reporter before I was. He read every story that I wrote. He corrected everything from the grammar to you've got the wrong lead here, and everybody does do that occasionally. But I really learned to be a reporter in those days because he taught me. He taught me ethics. You know, you can't use this guy's name until he tells you personally that, and just little things and large things I learned from him. Well, now, when the news organizations are under such economic pressures that they're in now, that editor isn't there anymore. There may be one editor, and so they're not going to get that close editing that we all got in those days. And so if these kids are going to be trained to be reporters, they're going to need to know before they get the first job, and they're going to learn it from you and from the Schieffer School. So that's why I think I'm not only just proud of the College of Communications, I really feel we're filling a necessary and very important role in our society. So I really thank you all for, I couldn't be prouder of, and I'm telling you, this woman, she doesn't fool around either. She reminds me a lot of some of those people that were elected to office. I mean, she's not afraid to knock a head together when it needs to be, and she also has real vision and great respect for truth and the news. So, Chris, I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you how thankful we are for all of our donors and supporters. Yesterday was TCU Gives Day. And we're a little proud in the Schieffer College that we were the first of all the schools and colleges yesterday to reach 100 gifts in support of our college. Whether they were $5 gifts or $5,000 gifts, they matter to our faculty and students. And I want to tell you that we are able today to award 2 What's Next grants in honor of our 5th anniversary named as the Schieffer College. So the first grant, $1,000, will go to Professors Melissa Schrader and Debbie Iba of our department. They will be working in the spring semester with a group of students who are studying intercultural communication. And they will have the opportunity to meet with and dine with women who are survivors of the Rwandan genocide from 1994. And they will be studying how food can be a transformative agent. The way that we talk about the food we did eat or the food we wish to eat reflects something about our identities and our priorities. And in this project, the students will be learning from these Rwandan women how they have used food and talk about food as a peacekeeping and a reconciliation technique. So we're thrilled to award that grant today. We're also awarding a $2,000 What's Next grant to Professor Andrew Ledbetter and one of our graduate students, Colton Meissner, also in our communication studies field. They couldn't be here today because they're off doing a presentation about their work at a conference, but they are studying how social media are transforming individual social media users' identities, especially social media users who seek to profit from their social media presences. So they are observing and interviewing people who are creating live streaming content that is no longer personal but becomes much more commercial. So we're thrilled to invite, to honor those two What's Next grants. Now, because this is a 5th birthday party, you're 5 today, Bob, we want to invite you to have what happens at a 5th birthday party, a treat out in the lobby. But the other thing we need, of course, at a 5th birthday party is you have a treat or prize to take home if you attended. So a couple of celebrities are in the house today. Abby Wydick and Brandon Kitchen, come on up. Abby is president of TCU Student Government and a communication studies major in the Schieffer College. Brandon is the reigning Mr. TCU and a journalism major in the Schieffer College. And as you know, we try to live up to Bob Schieffer's example. So our anniversary, our 5th birthday gift today is... We rock in purple socks.
That's great. All right. Well, here's mine. Right there.
Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, man. Those are great.
So please join us, have a sweet treat, and please become a walker in purple socks with us. Have a t-shirt. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.